like, subscribe, and share. Story 1. The Cat's Eyes at Night. I've always loved animals. That's why I became a pet sitter in the first place, offering my services to people who needed someone trustworthy to look after their furry companions. Most pets are easy to care for, and I find the job calming, giving me a sense of connection to the animals I care for. But one particular assignment, in a house on the outskirts of town, changed everything. It was supposed to be a straightforward gig. The Johnsons, a middle-aged couple, were going on a week-long vacation to the coast, and they needed someone to look after their cat, Whiskers. The cat had always been a little finicky with strangers, but nothing that a few days of good care couldn't fix. I was to stay at their house, ensuring Whiskers was fed, comfortable, and had everything she needed. Little did I know, this would be the most terrifying experience of my life. I arrived at the Johnsons' house late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The house itself was charming, but had a certain quietness to it. Situated at the edge of a wooded area, it looked like the kind of place that could be beautiful in the daytime, but a bit eerie as dusk settled in. The house was 2 stories, with large windows that overlooked the forest behind. Whiskers greeted me with a wary meow as I stepped through the front door. She was a sleek, black cat with emerald eyes that glinted in the dim light. She seemed to size me up for a moment, but after a brief hesitation, she rubbed against my legs, accepting me as her temporary caretaker. It seemed like she would be fine. I made myself comfortable, unpacking my things and settling into the living room while Whiskers explored. As the night wore on, the house grew quieter. I watched TV for a while, the soft hum of the screen filling the silence. Whiskers hopped up onto the couch beside me, curling up near my feet. I felt a sense of peace, thinking that the worst part of the job, settling in with a new pet, was behind me. But as I tried to relax, I noticed something strange. At around p.m., Whiskers suddenly shot up from the couch, her body rigid and her ears flattened against her head. Her eyes were locked on something in the corner of the room, staring at the wall with intense concentration. I looked around, trying to see what had caught her attention. There was nothing there, just the shadows cast by the dim lighting and the rustling trees outside the window. "Whiskers?" I called softly, but the cat didn't move. Her gaze remained fixed on the corner. I shrugged it off as a typical cat quirk. Maybe there was a mouse in the walls or some other small creature that had caught her attention. I tried to get her to relax, but she didn't respond. It was as if she couldn't hear me. I tried to focus on the TV again, but it was difficult with the tension building in the room. Whiskers continued to stare, her eyes unblinking, her body frozen. I couldn't help but feel a growing unease, but I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Cats were strange, after all. The following day, things seemed normal again, at least on the surface. I went about my routine, feeding Whiskers, playing with her, and cleaning up around the house. The eerie feeling I had felt the previous evening started to fade, replaced by the mundane tasks of pet sitting. But as night approached once again, the atmosphere in the house began to change. Around p.m., I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone when I heard a faint sound. It was the softest rustling noise, almost like fabric brushing against the floor. I froze, listening intently. The noise came again, faint, but definitely there. It sounded like something or someone was moving in the room. I glanced down at Whiskers, who was once again fixated on the same corner of the room. Her eyes were wide, her body tense. She was silent, her gaze locked onto the spot where the sound had originated. I felt my pulse quicken as the air in the room seemed to thicken with an unexplainable dread. There was no logical explanation for the sound I had heard. It wasn't a breeze or the trees outside. It was something closer, something that didn't belong. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Whiskers' eyes never left the corner. I crept toward it cautiously, my footsteps barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. As I reached the spot where the cat was staring, I paused. There was nothing there, no sign of movement, no indication that anything had happened at all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to go to bed early that night. The house felt unsettling, and I figured sleep would help clear my mind. Whiskers followed me upstairs, as she had done the night before, and jumped up onto the bed, I tried to relax, but the thought of those eerie eyes locked on the corner haunted me. Eventually, I drifted into an uneasy sleep. Around a.m., I was jolted awake by a soft sound, a soft thud, followed by a faint scraping noise. My eyes shot open, and my breath caught in my throat. The house was dark, save for the moonlight filtering through the window, casting long shadows across the room. Whiskers was sitting at the foot of the bed, her eyes wide and locked onto the corner again. I stared at her for a moment, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. I didn't dare move, afraid to disturb whatever was happening in the room. I strained my ears, listening intently for any more sounds. And then, I heard it, a whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. A soft voice, too soft to make out the words. It came from the corner of the room, where Whiskers had been staring all night. I wasn't sure if I was hearing things. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe I was just imagining it. But Whiskers wasn't imagining it. She wasn't moving, but her eyes were fixed on that spot with an intensity I couldn't ignore. Slowly, I reached for my phone, the screen lighting up in the dark. But before I could gather my thoughts, the whisper came again, louder this time, unmistakable. Leave. The voice was sharp, chilling, and filled with an unmistakable malice. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, terrified, unable to move. Whiskers' gaze intensified, her pupils dilating to almost impossible proportions as she let out a low, guttural growl. It wasn't the playful meow I had heard earlier. No, this was something else, something primal, something ancient. The room grew colder. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath in the air. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no rational explanation. I was alone in the house with the cat who seemed to be communicating with something or someone in the walls. I had to get out of there. The next day, I made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things in a frantic hurry, barely able to gather my composure. Whiskers was sitting in the living room, staring at me as if she knew exactly what I was thinking. I couldn't explain what had happened to me, and I didn't care to try. All I knew was that something in that house had been watching me, something that I couldn't see but could feel, a presence that had been there long before I arrived. As I left, I glanced back at the house one last time. The moonlight bathed the building in a cold, ghostly light, and in that moment, I saw it. A shadow. It moved across the window, faint and dark, like something or someone was standing just behind the glass, watching me leave. I never went back to the Johnson's house, and I never took another job as a pet sitter. Whiskers may have been just a cat, but the eyes she had were not of this world. And the whisper, it still echoes in my mind. The house was not empty, and neither was Whiskers. Story 2. The Dog's Loyalty. I've always considered myself a lover of animals, especially dogs. They're loyal, protective, and endlessly loving companions. That's why, when I received a call from the Sanders family, asking me to take care of their dog, Max, while they were away on a week-long vacation, I didn't hesitate. Max was a large, golden retriever with a sweet disposition, and I was confident it would be an easy gig. But the Sanders house, a secluded farmhouse just outside of town, would prove to be more than I bargained for. I arrived at the Sanders house late in the afternoon, greeted by Max's enthusiastic barking as soon as I pulled into the driveway. His tail wagged so hard that his whole body shook, and his eyes sparkled with excitement as I stepped out of the car. He bounded over to me, practically knocking me over with his joy. I chuckled, scratching behind his ears, and he seemed to settle into a calm, affectionate demeanor. The Sanders house was beautiful, but isolated. Nestled between tall trees and surrounded by thick forest on all sides, the house had a rustic charm. I settled in, making myself comfortable while Max followed me around, happily wagging his tail. The family had left detailed instructions, and I had everything I needed to care for Max's feeding schedule, exercise routines, even a few special commands that the dog was trained to follow. For the first few hours, everything seemed perfect. Max and I went for a walk around the property, and I marveled at how peaceful it was. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the birds chirped from the branches. As the sun began to set, I returned to the house with Max, fed him his dinner, and made myself comfortable for the night. That was when things started to get strange. Around 9 p.m., as I sat in the living room watching TV, I noticed Max behaving a little differently. Normally, he would settle on his bed in the corner of the room and fall asleep. But tonight, he was restless. He paced back and forth, his tail tucked between his legs. He seemed to be fixated on the front door, staring at it intently, as though waiting for someone to enter. I chalked it up to the change in environment. Perhaps Max was feeling a little anxious, or maybe he was simply reacting to the fact that his owners were no longer around. I tried to comfort him, calling him over and patting him gently, but he ignored me. Instead, he continued to stare at the door, his body tense. At one point, I decided to check the door, just to make sure it was locked. As I approached, I felt a strange sense of unease, like someone was watching me. I opened the door, stepped outside, and scanned the yard. There was nothing unusual. The night was quiet, and the only sound I could hear was the rustling of leaves in the wind. I closed the door and went back inside, but Max still hadn't relaxed. He was standing near the door, his eyes wide and unblinking, his posture rigid. It was as though he was waiting for something to happen. I tried to get him to calm down, but it wasn't until I opened the window and let in some fresh air that he finally seemed to settle. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I lay in bed, listening to Max's soft breathing from downstairs, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking about how strange his behavior had been, and the odd sense of unease I felt in the house. Was it just my imagination? Or was there something else going on? The next evening, the situation escalated. I had just finished preparing Max's dinner when I heard the first sound, a low, guttural growl. I turned to see Max standing near the back door, his eyes fixed on the dark woods beyond the house. He growled again, louder this time, and his body was trembling. His fur stood on end, and his tail was stiff, as though he were ready to spring into action. I walked over to him, trying to calm him down, but Max didn't respond. He was completely fixated on the trees outside. I stepped closer to the door, peering out into the darkness, but I saw nothing. Just the usual trees and the shadows cast by the moonlight. Still, something felt wrong. As the night wore on, Max grew increasingly agitated. Every now and then, I would hear a faint sound, footsteps, distant and irregular, coming from the direction of the woods. It was as though someone, or something, was moving through the forest, just beyond the reach of the light. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, the oppressive weight of something watching us. Max's howls grew louder and more frantic. He began barking incessantly, pacing back and forth in front of the door, as if trying to get out. I tried to comfort him, but he wouldn't let me near him. His growls were deep, his teeth bared, and I could see the fear in his eyes. It was as though he was trying to protect me from something that was out there in the dark. I decided to take him for a walk, hoping that a change of scenery would calm him down. But as we walked through the yard, Max's behavior only became more erratic. He tugged at the leash, pulling me towards the far end of the property, where the forest was densest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I followed him, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over me. Max was no longer walking. He was running, as if driven by some unseen force. I shouted at him to stop, but he didn't listen. He kept running, pulling me deeper into the woods. I struggled to keep up, my heart racing. We reached the edge of a small clearing, and Max stopped abruptly. He stood there, panting heavily, staring into the trees ahead. I followed his gaze and froze. There, in the clearing, was a figure. It was a person, but there was something wrong about them. The figure was tall and thin, wearing a dark hooded cloak that obscured their face. They stood perfectly still, their hands hanging at their sides, as if waiting. I couldn't make out any other details, but the sight of them sent a wave of terror crashing over me. I took a step back, but Max growled and stepped in front of me, as if protecting me from whatever that thing was. For a moment, the figure remained motionless, and then, without a sound, it disappeared into the trees. I stumbled backward, dragging Max with me, not daring to look back. My heart was pounding in my chest as I hurried back toward the house. When we returned, I locked all the doors and windows, but Max refused to settle down. He paced back and forth in the living room, his body tense, his eyes darting around the house as if expecting something to appear at any moment. I couldn't sleep that night. The encounter in the woods had shaken me to my core, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The following morning, I called the Sanders family. I didn't know what else to do. I had to ask them about Max's strange behavior, and I had to know if they had experienced anything unusual in the house before. Mrs. Sanders answered the phone, and I explained everything that had happened over the past few days. She was silent for a long moment before she spoke, her voice tense. "I was hoping you wouldn't have to know this," she said quietly. "Max has always been more than just a dog. He's protective. The house has a history. There's something in the woods, something that has been there for generations. Our family has always had dogs, and they've always been able to sense the presence of the thing that haunts this land." I felt a chill run down my spine as she continued. "Max is guarding you. He's been guarding this house for years, and there's a reason he was acting so strange. He's trying to protect you from something that's out there in the woods. It's not just a superstition. People have gone missing around here. People who got too close to whatever is hiding in those trees." Her words sent a shiver through me. I never stayed in the house again. I packed up my things and left, and I made sure to never return. Max's loyalty had saved me that night. His instincts, his unshakable loyalty to protect me, had kept me from an unimaginable fate. I'll never forget the look in his eyes, the deep growls that rumbled from his chest, warning me of the danger just beyond the trees. Whatever was in those woods, I never wanted to find out. But Max, the loyal protector, had kept me safe from whatever dark force lingered in the shadows. And for that, I would always be grateful. Story 3. The Silent Warning of the Cat. It's often said that cats are enigmatic creatures, aloof, mysterious, and sometimes downright unnerving, but I had always found comfort in their quiet, independent nature. I was no stranger to pet sitting, and when the opportunity arose to look after a cat named Luna for a couple in the countryside, I jumped at the chance. The couple, the Harpers, were headed out of town for a few weeks, and they needed someone to care for their beloved cat. Luna was a sleek, silver tabby with large green eyes that seemed to look straight into your soul. The Harpers assured me that she was friendly, though a bit shy, and I had no reason to doubt them. But over the next few days, I learned that Luna's quiet presence masked a secret that would unravel the very fabric of my understanding. I arrived at the Harpers' house late in the afternoon, after a long drive through winding country roads. The house was beautiful, a large Victorian-style home surrounded by overgrown ivy and thick trees. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the front yard. As I rang the doorbell, Luna appeared at the window, her green eyes shining from within the house, watching me. She didn't move, just stared. Mrs. Harper opened the door, greeting me warmly. She seemed kind, though a bit frail, as if age had taken its toll. Her husband, Mr. Harper, was already out on the porch, loading their luggage into the car. They seemed like a sweet couple, but there was something strange about the house. The air was thick, heavy, as if the house was holding its breath. It felt like it had seen more than its fair share of time and secrets. "We'll be back in a couple of weeks," Mrs. Harper said, her voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "Please make yourself at home. Luna is very well behaved, but she tends to keep to herself. Don't worry if she seems distant, she's just shy." I nodded and reassured her I would take good care of Luna. Mrs. Harper gave me a strange look as she handed over the keys, and then, with a final glance at Luna, the couple left, their car disappearing down the long driveway. The house felt eerily quiet as I stepped inside. Luna had retreated to a corner of the living room, watching me from a distance. Her large eyes followed my every move, unblinking and unyielding. I settled in, unpacked my bags, and started to get comfortable. But every time I glanced at Luna, she was watching me. The silence between us felt heavy, oppressive, as if something was pressing down on the house. That night, after I had finished feeding Luna and gotten ready for bed, I tried to relax in the living room. The house was old, with creaky floors and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. but Luna's presence was something I couldn't ignore. She sat in the same corner, staring at me, her eyes reflecting the dim light from the lamp. I shivered, feeling a strange unease in my chest, but I brushed it off. After all, it was just a cat. I turned off the lights and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking about Luna's eyes, and the way she never blinked. I finally drifted off to sleep, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day, I went about my usual routine, feeding Luna, playing with her, and exploring the house. I was starting to feel a bit more at ease. Though Luna remained distant, she didn't want to be petted or played with, but she never left my side, always watching from a distance. It was as if she was keeping tabs on me, making sure I stayed within her field of vision. That evening, after dinner, I decided to take a walk around the property. The sun was setting, and the landscape looked even more beautiful in the soft, golden light. The woods at the edge of the property were dense, the trees tall and dark, their branches reaching out like long, gnarled fingers. The wind rustled through the leaves, carrying with it the scent of earth and pine. I walked around the perimeter, my footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway, but something about the woods seemed to draw me in. I felt a strange pull, as though something was calling me from within the trees. As I walked back toward the house, I noticed Luna sitting in the window, staring out at me. Her green eyes were fixed on my every movement. I waved, but she didn't respond. Instead, she simply stared, unblinking and motionless. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt an irrational urge to hurry inside. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept hearing noises, scratching sounds from somewhere in the house, soft and intermittent, like something or someone was moving in the walls. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the creaks and groans of an old house settling, but Luna's behavior was starting to bother me. She never once slept. Every time I looked up from my bed, I would see her sitting on the edge of the room, watching me with those unblinking eyes. At one point, I got up to use the bathroom. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from a small lamp in the living room. As I passed by the living room, I saw Luna sitting in her usual spot, her eyes reflecting the faint glow. But as I looked at her, I felt something strange, something was off. Her gaze was no longer just watching me, it was warning me. I couldn't explain why, but the look in her eyes made my skin crawl. It was like she was trying to tell me something I didn't understand. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of dread weighing heavily on my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that Luna was trying to communicate something important. I decided to take a closer look around the house, just to see if I could figure out what was causing this unsettling tension. That afternoon, while Luna napped in her usual spot, I explored the house a bit more thoroughly. I had already gone through most of the rooms, but there was one door in the hallway that I hadn't yet opened. It was a wooden door, with a faded brass handle, and it led to a room I hadn't seen before. The door had no lock, but something about it made me hesitate. I approached the door slowly, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the handle. I turned it and pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light filtering in from a small window high on the wall. The air in the room was cold and musty, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I stepped inside and immediately felt a wave of unease wash over me. The room was bare, save for a few pieces of old furniture covered in dusty sheets. But what struck me most was the strange smell, something faintly metallic, mixed with the scent of mildew. As I stepped further in, I noticed something unusual: scratches on the wooden floor. They were deep, jagged lines, as if something had been dragged across the floor with great force. I turned to leave, but as I did, something caught my eye. A small, ornate box sat on a table in the far corner of the room. It was delicate, with intricate carvings along its surface. I couldn't resist the urge to open it. My fingers trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside was an old photograph, faded and torn at the edges. It was a picture of a man and a woman, smiling in front of the house. But there was something wrong with the photo. The woman's face was blurred, as if it had been smudged, but her eyes were clear, and they looked straight at me. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I slammed the box shut, backing away from the table. As I did, I noticed something else on the wall opposite the window. There was a large mirror. It wasn't until I was about to turn away that I saw her. The woman in the photograph, her face was now in the mirror. She was standing behind me, her blurry face now unmistakable, her eyes locked onto mine. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me. I stumbled back into the living room, gasping for breath. Luna was there, sitting on the windowsill, watching me intently. But this time, her eyes weren't filled with curiosity or detachment, they were filled with something else. Understanding. As the sun set that evening, I sat on the couch, trembling with the realization that Luna had been warning me all along. She had known about the presence in that room. She had known that the house was not as empty as it seemed, and she had been trying to protect me. The woman in the mirror wasn't just a ghost. She was a warning, and Luna had been guarding me from her, keeping me away from the secrets buried within those walls. That night, I packed my things and left. I never went back to the Harper's house. Luna's eyes, those silent, watchful eyes, had shown me a truth I could never forget.